Macon, Georgia, August 1956. The air sits heavy and thick the way only a southern summer can make it, the kind of heat that presses down on a man's shoulders and makes him feel the weight of the world twice over. On a narrow side street off Cotton Avenue, 2 police cruisers have pulled up in front of a small barbershop, the kind of place with a hand-painted sign, a red and white pole, and a front window fogged just enough from the cold air inside to make it look like something worth protecting. The officers aren't asking questions, they aren't writing citations. They're shutting it down, and the man who built it with his own 2 hands is standing on the sidewalk watching everything he owns get taken from him. What happens next will be remembered by everyone who witnesses it, but nobody sees it coming. Elijah Drummond was 51 years old in the summer of 1956, and he had spent 30 of those years building something in Macon that most men in his position were never supposed to have. He'd come up from Valdosta as a young man with a pair of barber's shears his father had given him, a man who had learned the trade from another man, who had learned it from another before that, a chain of inheritance stretching back through hardship and dignity to a time when passing down a skill was the most defiant act a father could commit. Elijah had apprenticed under a barber named Thomas Reese on Cherry Street, sweeping floors for 2 years before he was ever allowed to touch a customer's hair. He'd learned patience in that barbershop. He'd learned that a man who cuts another man's hair holds something sacred between his hands, not just hair and skin, but confidence, trust, the quiet ritual of being made to look your best. By 1948, he had saved enough to lease a small storefront on Hazel Street, not far from Pleasant Hill, the neighborhood where most of Macon's black families had built their lives in the years since Reconstruction. He painted the interior himself, a pale cream on the walls, 2 barber chairs he bought second-hand from a shop in Atlanta that had gone out of business, a row of 4 wooden waiting chairs that he'd reupholstered with a dark green vinyl. He hung a small framed photograph of his wife Cora near the mirror, not for the customers, but because he liked to look at her while he worked. Cora had passed in 1952 from a chest illness that moved too fast for any doctor to slow down. She never saw the shop in its full form, never saw the regulars who came in every Saturday morning, never saw the way the neighborhood had made Elijah's place into something more than a barbershop, a meeting room, a confessional, a church without pews. By 1956, Drummond's barbershop was the kind of institution that a community builds quietly over years, without ceremony or announcement. Elijah had a waiting list on Saturdays. He employed 2 young men from the neighborhood as assistants. He extended credit to men who were between jobs and never made them feel shame for it. He kept a jar of hard candy near the door for children and a stack of newspapers for men who wanted to read. He had never been in trouble with the law. He had never raised his voice in anger at anyone on that street. He had simply built something good in a place that gave him little room to do so, and he had protected it with his labour and his character every single day for 8 years. What brought the police to his door that August morning was a complaint, the nature of which was never formally specified in any document, because it didn't need to be. The city of Macon in 1956 had mechanisms for shutting down businesses owned by black men when those businesses became inconvenient to someone with more influence. A competitor across town had made certain inquiries, a council member had made certain calls, and by 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, 2 officers arrived to inform Elijah Drummond that his operating license had been suspended pending a review that everyone on that street understood would never resolve in his favour. He was told to close the doors. He was told not to resist. He stood on the pavement in his barber's apron with a pair of shears still in his hand and watched an officer hang a notice on his door, and the look on his face was not the look of a man defeated. It was the look of a man who had spent his entire life being told the rules would never apply to him the way they applied to others, and who had never quite been able to stop believing they might. A small crowd had gathered, neighbours, customers, children who had been walking to school and stopped when they sensed something wrong in the air. Nobody spoke loudly. This was 1956 in Georgia, and speaking loudly in that moment carried consequences that everyone present understood with their whole bodies. And then, from down the block, a large American car moved slowly along the street and came to a stop at the curb. The man who stepped out of that car was not from Macon. That much was immediately apparent to the people standing on the sidewalk, not because of how he was dressed, though he was dressed well. A light cotton shirt, dark trousers, a wide-brimmed hat that he wore the way men who've spent time on film sets carry all their clothing, like it belongs on them, like they were assembled by a costumer with authority. He was tall, broad across the chest and shoulders in the manner of a man who had once been a physical labourer and whose body had retained that information even as the decades added weight and age to it. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried quality that seemed almost theatrical in the context of the anxious, compressed energy on that sidewalk, and yet it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like the man genuinely did not operate at a different speed depending on who was watching. He had come to Macon for a personal reason, travelling between Atlanta and Savannah on a route that had taken him off the main highway and into the city, for reasons he would later describe simply as wanting to stretch his legs and find a decent cup of coffee. He had not come to be a witness. He had not come looking for injustice to correct. He was, by his own later account, simply a man passing through a city on a hot morning, the same as any other morning on a long road. He had been travelling with a single associate, a younger man named Dale Holt, who worked in a peripheral capacity in the film industry and who would later be the primary source for accounts of what happened that day. Holt remained in the car. The large man stood on the pavement and looked at the scene with the specific attention of someone who is very practiced at reading a room. He saw the officers' cruisers. He saw the notice on the door. He saw Elijah Drummond standing on the pavement in his apron with his shears in his hand. He saw the crowd of neighbours maintaining a careful, frightened distance. He stood at the curb for a long moment, perhaps 10 seconds, perhaps 15, and anyone watching him during those seconds would have seen something shift in his expression. Not anger exactly, something quieter than anger and deeper. Something that looked like a man doing a very quick and private accounting of who he was against what he was seeing. Whatever arithmetic he ran in those 15 seconds, it produced a decision. He took off his hat, held it in one hand, ran the other hand through his hair, and started walking toward the barber shop. The officers saw him before Elijah Drummond did. They recognised him almost immediately. It would have been nearly impossible not to in 1956 in America, and the recognition produced a visible confusion in both men. That particular freeze that comes over people when the world in front of them does not match the categories their minds have prepared for. One of the officers took a half step forward, not aggressively but reflexively, the way a man moves when something surprises him and his body reacts before his thinking does. The man kept walking. He walked past the small crowd of neighbours who had by now also recognised him, though their recognition produced a different response. A murmur, a held breath, a sudden stillness that was different in quality from the frightened stillness that had preceded it. He walked past the officer who had taken the half step forward, nodded at him in the brief, acknowledging way that he nodded at everyone, without hostility and without submission, and stopped in front of Elijah Drummond. He looked at the notice on the door. He looked at Elijah. He looked at the shears in Elijah's hand, and then back at Elijah's face. And then, according to Dale Holt, who was watching through the windshield of the car at the curb, John Wayne said something quiet to the barber, something that Holt couldn't hear from that distance, and Elijah Drummond looked at him for a moment with an expression that Holt would later describe as a man trying to understand whether the ground he was standing on was real. And then Wayne reached out and opened the door of the barber shop, the door with the notice on it, the door the officers had just told this man to keep closed, and he walked inside. He sat down in the barber's chair. He took off his hat, set it in his lap, and he looked in the mirror at Elijah Drummond, who had followed him in and was now standing behind the chair with his shears in his hand. And the only explanation any witness ever offered for what Drummond did next was that some things have their own gravity. Some gestures pull you toward them before you've decided to move. Elijah Drummond draped a barber's cape around the shoulders of John Wayne and began to cut his hair. The two officers stood in the doorway for a long moment. The crowd on the sidewalk had grown. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke above a murmur. The officer who had taken the half-step forward looked at his partner, and his partner looked at the floor, and after a long interval, 4 minutes, 5, long enough to feel geological, the two men walked back to their cruisers and drove away. What happened in the 30 minutes that followed belongs to the kind of history that doesn't get written into official records, because nobody in an official position wanted it there. But the neighbourhood remembered. The men and women who were standing on that sidewalk on Hazel Street on a Tuesday morning in August of 1956 carried what they saw with them for the rest of their lives, and they told it to their children, and their children told it in the way that oral history survives, shaped a little by each telling, but anchored by the emotional truth at its centre, which was this, that a man who had every reason to keep driving had instead chosen to sit down. Inside Drummond's barbershop, the work continued. There was the sound of the shears, the soft hiss of the ceiling fan, the occasional muted noise from the street outside. Dale Holt eventually came in and stood near the door, watching. The two young assistants who worked for Elijah, men named Marcus Webb and Curtis Reeves, both in their early 20s, both from Pleasant Hill, had arrived for their shift and found the scene already in progress. Marcus would later say that walking through that door and seeing what he saw made him feel, for a moment, like the air in the room had a different quality than the air outside, like something was being demonstrated in that small space about how the world could work if the people in it chose to work it differently. When the haircut was finished, Wayne stood and looked in the mirror and paid Elijah what was owed, and then, according to every account that has survived, he paid considerably more than what was owed. He shook Elijah's hand. He shook the hands of Marcus Webb and Curtis Reeves. He put his hat back on his head. At the door, he stopped, turned back, and looked at Elijah Drummond with the particular gravity of a man who wants to say something and has decided the right thing is to say it plainly, without decoration. The word that travelled down Hazel Street that morning, passed from neighbour to neighbour in the hours and days that followed, was not the word of a celebrity sighting, though it was partly that. The word that travelled was harder to name. It was the word of something witnessed, something that changed the temperature of the street, however briefly, something that reminded people standing in the heat of a Georgia August that a single act, performed without announcement or audience, could ripple outward in ways that no one standing there that morning could fully measure or predict. The operating license for Drummond's barbershop was reinstated within the week. There are things John Wayne said in interviews over the years that complicate the picture of him as a man of simple moral decency, and anyone who tells this story honestly has to hold that complication in view. He was a man of his era and his industry in ways that did not always do him credit. He held views that caused pain, and he expressed them in ways that were harmful. The fullness of who he was does not reduce to this one August morning on a side street in Macon, Georgia, any more than any man's fullness reduces to his finest hour or his worst one. But what happened in Drummond's barbershop was real, and it cost him something. Not his career. He was too large a figure by 1956 for a single act of decency in a Georgia barbershop to threaten what he built. But there were men in Macon with influence, men connected to the same network that had arranged the shutdown of Elijah's shop in the first place, and John Wayne's presence in that chair, witnessed, talked about, impossible to deny, made those men uncomfortable in a way that has its own significance. He knew, before he walked in that door, that he was making a choice that would be seen. He was not a man who moved through the world without awareness of how his movements were perceived. He walked in anyway. After the last handshake, after Dale Holt had gone back to the car and the crowd outside had begun to thin, Elijah Drummond and John Wayne stood near the front window of the barbershop for a moment, that Holt, watching from the car, later described as the two men simply standing together in the quiet, not performing anything, not constructing any meaning for anyone else's benefit. Just two men in a room after something significant had happened, each one aware of what the other had just done. Elijah by continuing, by picking up the shears and doing his work under circumstances that required extraordinary composure, and Wayne by sitting down, by making his presence the kind of argument that no ordinance and no complaint and no officer with a notice could easily overcome. Wayne said one thing before he left. Standing at the door, hat on, he looked back at Elijah and said quietly, "Every man's got a right to his work." It is not a complicated sentence. It is not eloquent in the way of speeches or declarations. But Elijah Drummond kept those words for the rest of his life, repeated them to his grandchildren when he was an old man in that same shop, which he ran for 23 more years until he retired in 1979. He kept them because they were said by a man who didn't have to say anything at all, a man who could have driven past, a man who, on a hot Tuesday morning in August 1956, did the simple and radical thing of choosing not to. The barber shop on Hazel Street stood for 31 years. Elijah Drummond outlived John Wayne by 5 years, passing in 1984 at the age of 79, surrounded by the community he had spent his life serving. The photograph of Cora hung on the wall of that shop until the last day it was open. There is a particular kind of heroism that never announces itself, that doesn't arrive with cameras or speeches or the architecture of public virtue. It arrives in a car on a Tuesday morning, and it sits down in a chair, and it makes one small, irreversible choice in a room full of people who are watching to see what the world is made of. What John Wayne did on Hazel Street in Macon, Georgia in the summer of 1956 will not be found in any biography written about him, not in full, not with the weight it deserves. It exists in the way that so much of real history exists, in the memory of people who were there, in the telling of it across generations, in the way a community carries the moments when someone chose their better nature over their convenient one. We remember the men and women who marched, who stood at counters, who filled the jails and the courtrooms and the streets. Their courage was enormous and their sacrifice was real. But history also lives in quieter moments, in the men and women who simply refused to walk past, who sat down when standing aside was easier, who said with their presence what no speech could have said with words. Ask yourself what it means that one man's decision to sit in a barber's chair could restore another man's livelihood. Ask yourself what world we might live in if more people with the weight to change a room chose to enter the rooms that needed changing. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something you believe about decency and courage and the power of a single human choice, we want to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us, what does quiet heroism look like to you? Because it is still happening every single day. And sometimes it looks like nothing more than a man walking through a door.